My name is Ian Leach. I'm Community Engagement and Supportive Care Manager at St Giles Hospice. St Giles is based in a little village called Whittington, just outside Lichfield. And we have an inpatient unit here. We care for people in their own homes as well. And as part of our community engagement strategy, we like to create compassionate communities, or try and create compassionate communities. And that's really how the Understanding Bereavement workshops came about. We go into schools and deliver these in schools. We go into businesses and deliver into individual businesses and to groups as well. So, you know, a WI group, a Rotary, charitable organisations. The idea is if you can support somebody in your workplace, you can support somebody in your friendship circle, you can support somebody in your family. And it's about, as I say, just giving people a very generic understanding of grief. One thing I won't do during the session is go into sort of individual types of grief. So like grief from suicide or grief from stillbirth or something like that. And the reason I don't do that is because if we were to explore every different type of grief, we wouldn't be here for an hour and a half. We'd probably be here for a week and a half. So it's for that reason that the presentation is very generic. One thing I always say at the start of these sessions is, obviously, I don't know your individual circumstances. So if for any reason something happens that you know, we talk about, and it triggers something in you that triggers your grief, and you need to step away from the screen, then please do. You know, you don't have to be on video if you don't want to. You can be muted. If you find it too much, then, you know, by all means dip out. I'm not here to make anybody feel uncomfortable. So, and again, I say that at all sessions, whether they're on Zoom or whether they're on, you know, they're done in the community, sort of face to face. Obviously, confidentiality, what anybody shares in the room, in the Zoom room, stays in the Zoom room. And as I also say when I'm out in the community, I will be the last person to leave the room. So if there is anybody who wants to have a little chat at the end, then I'm the last person to leave. Well, probably Steve is, actually, because he's host, but you know, I'll be the last person apart from Steve to leave. So I'm going to put the presentation up now, and we'll get underway. Something else I should I mention is that 12 years ago, my daughter, aged 20, sadly died. She died of cancerous illness. And at the time, I was working for Staffordshire Police. I wasn't a policeman. You can't tell on the screen. Obviously, I'm 6'2", and people always assume when I say I worked for the police that I was a policeman, but I wasn't. I worked in the support services. And they, as an organisation, they were brilliant. And when I started in this role, it sort of gave me, if you like, the inspiration to sort of spread the word around about what, you know, what is good practice and what necessarily isn't good practice. So the first half of the session, I'm going to be talking about grief. The second half of the session will be more about grief in the workplace. So what you can do as an organisation to support your staff members, to support your colleagues, etc. Little bit of information around replacing an employee. They had a survey for Dying Matters Week, and over 57% of people who were surveyed said that if they weren't supported well during their grief, that they would leave the organisation that they worked for. And you know, obviously that don't need me to tell you, that's over half. And when you look at the stats here, you know, replacing an employee could cost you 20 to 40k. That's quite a conservative estimate. I think in the report it actually says 30k. You can see the link at the bottom. And when I showed this slide, often people would say to me, oh, it'd be more than that. It'd be a lot more than that. And actually, that's why I put up there 20 to 40. And if you include things like the costs of recruitment and, you know, the loss of productivity, training somebody new, then it all does add up. So actually supporting somebody through their grief benefits you as a business, as well as sort of benefiting you as an organisation, as a human being. And you know, it's the right thing to do, obviously. And even if you experience a temporary loss of productivity, you know, that can affect you as an organisation. So some things before we start to sort of carry with you as we go through the presentation. Grieving can start before the person has died, and this is often referred to as pre-bereavement. So if you hear the term pre-bereavement, then basically it's somebody grieving for somebody who hasn't yet died. This we see a lot of this in St Giles. Obviously, as a hospice, we have people with life-limiting illnesses, and people will start, you know, their grief experience before the person is often died. And you can get pre-bereavement support. You can get support prior to somebody dying. I'm sure crews do it, and a lot of bereavement support organisations do it. I always remember delivering one of these sessions up in Leeds, I think it was, and a lady came to me at the end and thanked me for what I'd done. And she said, it's changed my whole perception of how I am, and at the moment who I am. And she went on to tell me that both her parents had been diagnosed as having life-limiting illnesses, and she'd become depressed. She'd been to the doctors. The doctor had given her the antidepressants, as they normally do with grief. Take these, you'll be fine. And she realised that she was, although her parents were both still alive, they had these diagnoses of being terminal, and she was grieving already. And that was she said, that's the reason for my behaviour. I can see it now. I didn't realise you could grieve before the person had died. So it is important to understand that. The experts used to say that grief had predicted stages and phases. So you'd go through denial, anger, guilt, bargaining, depression and acceptance, and you would be cured. And they actually use the word cured. I can tell you, you don't get cured from grief. Grief is something that happens in life. It is not an illness. You may get denial, you may get anger, you may get guilt, you may get any of them, but you may not. And also, just because you've had one of these doesn't mean you won't get it again. So just because you've got really angry through your grief doesn't mean you won't get angry again. They can come and go. And we'll talk a little bit about grief theory in a moment. I can honestly say for myself, I've never had anger because I don't know who to get angry with. I don't know what caused my daughter's illness. So because of that, I look towards, did I cause it? And then, that's where the guilt comes in. So, I've had probably 3 of those, but we're all different, and, we'll all experience different things. We need to be respectful of people's beliefs and cultures, and that goes without saying. And the reason I put that in there is because even if you have a particular belief, a particular culture, you will still grieve as an individual. So not all Christians, not all Muslims, not all Buddhists, not all atheists will grieve the same. You will grieve as an individual. And brings me on to the last point on this slide, and probably one of the most important parts of the whole presentation, is that everybody reacts differently to a bereavement. And that's what you need to understand. That's what you need to respect. And that has to be the starting point when you're supporting someone. So, just because you experience something in a certain way doesn't mean that, everybody will. Everybody is different. We're all individuals. We're all individuals as human beings. Why would we all grieve the same? So it's really important that that's understood. So on to a little bit of grief theory, and there are handouts. I don't know whether you've had them yet. I don't think you have, but no, Steve's shaking his head. But these will be sent out to you, and there's a lot of grief theory there out there, but these are the 2 that we tend to sort of adhere to. So, excuse me, the dual process model of coping with bereavement. You can see, if you can see this in front of you, you've got the oval shapes, and on the left-hand side, you've got loss-oriented, and on the right-hand side, you've got restoration-oriented. And loss-oriented is when the grief is battering you, when the grief is there, when your sadness is there, your tears may be there. The restoration is when you're doing the everyday things that you normally do, going to work, getting up, sorting out the children, going to the gym. And what we would call, or strobe and shut, and what we would call sort of healthy grief is when you're going between the 2. And that's what the zigzag lines on the diagram represent. So healthy grief, you know, you spend some time on the loss side and you spend some time on the restoration side. Grief becomes more complicated when you spend more time in one side, or too much time in one side or the other. So too much time in the loss side can be, you know, cannot be helpful, and the same with the rest. Too much time in the restoration side. And I will say also at this point that children are absolutely fantastic at bombing between the two. We support children as part of the work that we do, and we can have children who will be talking about the person who has died, and the next minute asking for pizza. And I had one of my friends ring me up. Actually, one of her neighbours, their little boy had sadly died, and he was only 6 years old. And she said, "Oh, my son, who is actually my godchild," she said, "Oh, he was talking to me about him, saying, oh, it's really sad and I'll miss him as a friend." And the next thing he was saying, "What are we having for tea?" And I said to her, I said, "Oh, that's perfectly normal. That's absolutely right." And her response was, "Thank God for that. I thought he was being an ungrateful little sod, and I was about to give him a clip round the ear roll." And I said, "Well, you can't give them kids clip round the ear roll anymore, but you know, it is normal, and it is the way that that children go. They bounce between the two." And the other theory is Tonkin's theory of growing around grief. So on the left-hand side of this diagram, you've got a sort of blank circle before the loss, and that's life basically. It's just you know, a white hole with a blue outline. I'm describing it for anybody who might not be able to see the diagram if they're watching on a phone. So if you're looking at it and thinking, and you can see it and thinking, "Oh crikey, why is he talking about this?" and that's why. And then underneath that, you have the loss when somebody dies, and the loss is the big black circle with just a very thin blue line still on the outside. People think that eventually the black hole gets smaller and, you know, the grief diminishes. But in reality, what happens is that black hole stays the same and life grows around the black hole. So your grief doesn't diminish, but your life grows around it. So, you know, I could, again, with my own thing, I work at St Giles now. I cycle, I do lots of walking, I've done lots of charity rides and stuff like that. That's my life growing around. You know, my daughter's about to have a baby, so if my phone does go off and I look down and you see a big smile on my face, that's because I've probably just been told that either my daughter's gone into labour or the baby's been born. So I better warn you about that. But that's life going on around the grief. So it's not the grief that diminishes, this business that it gets smaller in time. It's, you know, you grow around your grief. Your grief doesn't diminish. So what I'm going to share with you now are some of the behaviours associated with grief. And you look at these behaviours and you think, well, you know what, physical tiredness, if you had a cold, you know, you would have physical tiredness, you could be emotionally drained. But if somebody is grieving and they are displaying some of these behaviours, chances are it could be related to the grief. You know, we've all heard of comfort eating. We've heard of, you know, people losing their appetite. They're both associated with grief. Low mood swings, neglecting personal hygiene. They're all things that you see on there that are associated with grief. And it's important that we understand that, you know, if somebody's showing one of these behaviours, then it could well be connected to the grief. I had a gentleman speak to me at one of the sessions I did. He was a volunteer at an organisation, and he had been off work for 3 months with depression, and he was convinced that his depression was due to work, and he blamed everything on work, the way he was feeling, absolutely everything. And at the end of this session, he came up to me and he said, "I realise I've probably been looking in the wrong place." He said, because actually about the time I started getting depressed, my stepfather died and we had things that were unresolved. And I realized that that's probably the cause of my depression, and work was just being used as, you know, excuse is the right word, but it is that sort of thing. And, you know, sometimes we don't realize that we look for other things. Oh, no, it can't be the grief. I'm dealing with that. I can deal with that. You know, I'm being strong. But for this guy, it was a sort of wake-up call that, you know, there was other things that he probably needed to address. So those are some of the behaviours that are associated with grief. So we're going to do a little exercise now, and Steve is going to get you into breakout rooms, which I always think can be really interesting. If they work, they're brilliant. If they don't, they can be frustrating and then sometimes quite funny. We use them at one of our bereavement support groups that we've transferred online. And the two volunteers who were using them, they got people into the breakout rooms, but then couldn't get them out. So they spent the whole session in breakout rooms and had to ended up running everything in the breakout room because they couldn't find the way out of the breakout room. But we should be fine with that. So what we're going to do is we're going to do an exercise. So I'm going to share with you now this fictional workplace. Okay. So in my fictional workplace, we have Jane, who's the office manager. We have Jeff, who's the accounts manager. Kira, who works in sales. Jenny, who works in PA and admin support. And we have Mick, who is the caretaker. Okay, that's my little workplace, totally made up. If that is your workplace, I've not been spying on you. It is totally made up. And what we're going to do now is we're going to assign roles to the people in this workplace. So in this little workplace, I'm going to tell you a bit more about Jane first. Jane runs a tight ship. Some people even think she's a bit of a bully. She line manages several staff, deals with all the sickness in the workplace. She does the payroll. She's best friends with Jenny, who's the PA and admin support, and she deals with the major accounts. So that's Jane. Jeff, the accounts manager, handles all but the major accounts, knows a lot of influential people out in the business world. And yes, he's having an affair with Jenny. And he organises the socials in the office as well. So he's the person to go to who, when there's a social need in organising. And he also line manages Jenny as well. So interesting relationships there. Kira is the top salesperson. She'd like Jane's job. She secretly hankers after Jane's job. And she's always moaning about something. Nothing's ever perfect. Nothing's ever right. Jenny wants a baby. Whose? We don't know. She's got a great filing system, but only she understands it. She manages Jane's diary, and she answers all the incoming calls as well. So that's Jenny. So that's my workplace, my made-up workplace. What's going to happen now is I'm going to assign somebody in that workplace to sadly die. And what I would like you to do is to go into your breakout rooms, and I would like you to think about three things. I'd like you to discuss the loss impact on the people left behind. So how might it affect the people who are left behind? I'd like you to think about what could potentially happen to the roles in the workplace. And also, are there any feelings of guilt generated? So we talk about the losses, but are there any feelings of guilt? And are there any gains?
What about Mick? We've missed out Mick.
Oh, sorry. What about Mick? Sorry, it's because the list of attendees on the right-hand side. Well, Mick knows everyone and everything. He's the health and safety rep, and he's been at the firm for 40 years. Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you for letting me know. As I say, I can't see behind the list. So that's the organisation. So it's how the loss impacts on the people left behind, what could happen to the roles in the workplace, and are there any gains or feelings of guilt generated? So we'll put you into your breakout rooms. Steve, if you can do that now, and then when you come out, if somebody could act as a spokesperson to just sort of talk through your discussion. Difficult to deal with as well, because often with them comes guilt. So thank you for that. One of the things, or some of the things that you all touched on were around secondary losses. Secondary losses are the things that we lose as a result of a person dying. So the person who dies is the primary loss. The secondary loss is what we lose as a result of that person dying. And I think, Alison, you touched on it with some of your examples in particular. So if you're thinking of when, let me share my screen again. Where's it gone? Here we are. So if you're thinking of a colleague, then you know, your secondary losses might be the lunch times that you spent with that colleague. You know, it might be you spent your lunch times together. It might be you went to walk into the town and all of a sudden that colleague isn't there to do that. That is a secondary loss. It might be that they brought humour and banter to your, you know, your work relationship. That's a secondary loss. I'm sure somebody mentioned about the increasing workload. You know, the need to learn a new role. That familiarity of the old role and the old workload, that's, you know, that then becomes lost. If you've got somebody who's coming into a role living up to that person, you know, if Kira took on Jane's job, if it had been Jane, then living up to that role of the person lost, they're all things that are that are classed as secondary losses. To give you an idea of some other secondary losses in bereavement, you know, particularly if it's often when it's a partner who dies, there's the practical things. We support a lot of people whose partners have died, and the number that struggle with things like cooking or doing the finances. You know, oh, it's my husband always used to do the finances, or, you know, my husband always used to do the cooking. My wife always, you know, used to do the driving. I'm the driver in our house. You know, I do all the driving. My wife doesn't drive. And, you know, my wife always says to me, oh, if anything happened to you, I'd have to learn to use the bus timetables. She does our finances, and she's got this book full of amazing numbers that she understands every single one. That to me looks like, you know, a bad maths lesson. But it's learning that, you know, it's understanding those things, and those things that we lose. We all have our, you know, our responsibilities in our relationships. We all have things that we do. We all have our roles in our relationships. So when a partner dies, it can be very, you know, it can be very difficult to sort of take up some of those things. Of not being at the bottom there, if you can see the screen, it's of not being able to put wrongs right. It often happens, well, I'd say it often happens in soaps. It nearly always happens in soap operas. If somebody dies, a character dies in a soap opera, then before they die, somebody will have an argument with them. And then they're not able to put the wrongs right. And the next storyline is that person being racked with guilt because they, you know, couldn't say sorry, or there were things they wanted to say. Hidden anniversaries are anniversaries that are special to you, but other people may not know. So it might be the date you got engaged. It might be the date that you got married. It might be a date you went on your first holiday together. It might be the day you met. It might just be a day that you look back and on your Facebook memories, something pops up and you think, oh God, yeah, this time 5 years ago, we were doing this. And that can be a trigger for your grief. So secondary losses can often trigger those, you know, that grief and bring about that grief. So yeah, lots of different secondary losses. The one here in the top left, the relationship with the partner and spouse. It's said that 1 in 3 couples go their separate ways after the death of a child. My wife and I came within millimeters of being one of those statistics. You know, you don't understand how they grieve. They don't understand how you grieve. You stop talking because you don't want to upset the other person, and things deteriorate from there. So relationships, you know, can be very much a secondary loss. A little bit about children and grief. This slide that is on now looks at the concepts that children have around grief and death, and you'll see from sort of 0 to 2 years they don't have a concept of death. They don't understand it. They will notice the absence of a parent between 4 and 7 months. They'd be anxious about separating from the remaining parent. They may have feeding and sleeping difficulties, but other than that, it won't really affect them. But then when you move on from sort of 2 to 5 years, they still see death as reversible. And that's one of the reasons why with children, when you're talking to children about death, you should never use euphemisms. Never say the person's gone to sleep. Never say the person's, gone on a journey, that sort of thing, because often children will take things literally. And we all know that when you go to sleep, you wake up. And a lot of the young children that we support, their anxieties are stemmed from things that people have said. And young children are very good at making up fantasies. If they don't know the answers, they don't like to ask. So they'll make up their own gaps, and they may even blame themselves. Around sort of 5 to 12 years, they start to understand the finality. Around 8 years, they start to understand the finality of death. Again, as with adults, they're individual, so that may come a little bit earlier, it may come a little bit later. But you can see the behaviours there that, again, come out in children with grief. I'll tell you a little story. We were doing some staff bereavement training in a school, and we just talked about euphemisms, and one of the teachers put her hand over her mouth and just went, "Oh my goodness." And I thought she got a message on her phone or something like that. And she said, "I've just realised," she said, "my 4-year-old, her auntie died a few weeks ago, and we told her that her auntie had gone up into the sky." And I said, "Yeah, well, that's a really good example of a euphemism." "No, you don't understand. We're flying to Tenerife in 2 weeks. And I know she's going to be looking out the plane window for auntie, and she's going to start asking me all sorts of questions on the plane, and there's going to be people around, and we're going to have to go through, So it's a funny example, but it's a very good example of why we always say with children, when you're talking to children about death and dying, be honest and be sensitive, but certainly stay away from the euphemisms. And there's some great resources, some great websites, which will appear later in the presentation, of organisations that deal with explaining to children about death, and also how to support children through their grief, and they'll appear later on in the presentation. With teenagers, obviously they're more adult. They might start thinking about their own death. They might start feeling a need to be in control of their feelings. Difficult emotions, again, you see there: sadness, anger, shock. They may have some of them, they may not have any of them, they may be just numb about it, and you can see some of the possible behaviours: mood swings, sleep disturbance, changes in their peer groups, fighting, arguing, that sort of thing. But it's about having the conversations and trying to be honest and be sensitive, and get them to the same with younger children, to get them to open up and to talk. And sometimes they'll talk to, they won't talk to their parents, because I had a scenario where after a session I'd done, a young lad came up to me and he said, "Oh, can we refer into the St Giles Children's Service without our parents, without my mum knowing?" That was it, because Dad had died. And I said to him, "Yeah, you can do." I said, "But can I ask you why?" He says, "Oh, I don't want to upset Mum." And chances are that Mum would be so relieved if she thought that he was getting if he was getting support. So trying to get young people to talk, even if it's not to you, get them to talk to somebody and open up about how they're feeling is really important. A little bit about grief in the time of COVID. Separation at end of life, that's not at the moment so bad as it was, certainly not in the hospice setting. We did have a time when we didn't allow visitors in, but we are allowing limited visiting in now. But there is still those difficult decisions to make, that, if you can only have 4 or 5 visitors, who is it who misses out? Funerals and rituals, they've kept funerals with the latest round of stuff they've put in. Funerals are still at 30. You can have 30 people at a funeral, but even then, you were talking about some people missing out and not being able to go to the funeral, and that can really impact their grief as well. And I think at the moment, because we're still in the midst of COVID, the people's grief isn't necessarily coming out around this as much as we maybe thought it would. I think people are sort of almost putting it on the back burner, but we do expect there to be an increase in people's grief and illness related through that as time goes on, when the reality sinks in. Isolation and support networks. We run online bereavement support, and the one thing that comes across from the majority of people who access our online bereavement support is the isolation and the loneliness. Because not only, often have they, has their parent died or their partner died, but they can't go out and see the people who would normally be their support group. And then, mentioned before, other losses around, job security and things like that. That all comes into it, and the worry about what if I have time off. I was looking at, a few months ago, there was a possibility of myself being furloughed, and straight away it was like, oh crikey, this is the beginning of the end. If they're going to furlough me, it'll it'll mean that they don't want me anymore, and all those anxieties and all those worries sort of come out. So there's grief in time of COVID because of the number of deaths, but there's also other losses as well that secondary losses through COVID that are very real. In terms of supporting colleagues, it's about being supportive, showing empathy, respecting confidentiality, having an understanding. Listening is the greatest skill you can have when you're supporting somebody who's grieving. Having an acceptance and showing respect. And if you have those skills, or you show those skills, there's no reason why you can't support somebody through their grief. It's that's what it's about. So we look now at grief in the workplace. Now, these aren't rules. These aren't you have to do this. These are just ideas, maybe to get you thinking. When a colleague dies, responses might be dependent upon the role the person had. If we go back to the made-up workplace that we had, if you think about Jane in her office, other people might not see Jane so often, but they see Mick, the caretaker, every day. He's the one who comes and looks after them and sorts out their issues in the office, change the light bulbs and all that sort of thing. So, how well they were known and liked. And it's important to remember that not everybody is liked. So if somebody isn't, if somebody dies and somebody isn't crying and expressing their grief in that way, they shouldn't be, looked down upon, if you like, for that. That's, we're all different. And the circumstances as well, particularly if suicide or violent death is involved, and obviously in current times, COVID. With suicide or violent death, you may get media interest, and as an organisation, that's important to understand that, and you may have to deal with that. As an organisation, again, just a few ideas. It's really important to talk amongst your staff, and to keep your staff involved and keep them up to date with what's going on. At the moment, it's very difficult to have senior, manage meetings face to face. But use of Zoom, use of Teams, make sure that everybody knows. And when I say everybody, think about those that might be on maternity leave, think about those that might be on long-term sick, making sure that they're kept up to date with what's happened. Sometimes it's very easy if somebody's in the midst of a long-term sickness or 9 months maternity leave. It's important that you remember that they need to be kept informed as well. In terms of memorials, I mention memorials because memorials can be very difficult. If you're a large organisation and you will probably have 2 or 3 deaths in your organisation a year. If you decide that you're going to plant a tree in memory of someone, and then the next person says, "Oh, I'd like a tree," it's very difficult to turn around and say, "Well, you can't have it," because they turn around and say, "Well, that person had a tree, I wanted. That person had a bench, I wanted a bench." What I say with memorials is make sure that they're workable, and when you're setting a precedent, don't make it something that makes life difficult for you. If it's a bench, benches are great, but somebody has to look after that bench. It's and again, it's setting precedents. You have to be careful. Key messages: liaison and discussion with the family of the deceased employee is really important. Keeping people informed. Being aware of social media rumour as well, and as well as the immediate response, consideration needs to be, the ongoing needs of the staff. It isn't a case with grief that there's a time limit on it. It can last for months, it can last for years, it can last for a lifetime. And it's important that with anniversaries and things like that, and other triggers that may occur, that we understand where people might be in their grief. When someone close to a member of staff dies, it's about the members of the member of staff and their family. So if a member of staff's mother or a partner or child dies, it's about talking to them and asking what they want. Meeting with them to discuss their wishes, arrange a meeting with line management to see what what they want, inform staff face to face with the staff members' agreement. Now that can be sometimes difficult if they don't want anybody to know, but what I've found is 9 times out of 10, I don't think I'd say 10 times out of 10 with what I found, because I've never had an instance where somebody hasn't wanted somebody to know. They're quite grateful actually if you tell other people, because it saves them doing it. I always said one of the most difficult things I had to endure when my daughter died was ringing round everybody and telling them. And it was at that time, this wasn't a work thing, this was more family, but it's that thing of having to repeat the story over and over again when you might not be in a place to do it. So if somebody can do that for you, that can really help. And in the immediacy, again, a meeting at the end of the day, just to check in on everybody, see how they're doing, see what their plans are for that night or that weekend, and just make sure they're okay. Signposting to services I will talk about later in the presentation, but it's a really good thing to do. It's as an organisation, it shows you care and it gets you specialist support and help. Ongoing support for the bereaved person if required. And meetings with staff, and especially close supporters. And that's one of the key messages in this, is to remember the people who support the bereaved person. So when my wife went back to work, she sat opposite her friend, and her friend soaked up a lot of emotion, particularly in the first few weeks and months. So it's important that person is looked after, and are you okay? I appreciate you're supporting this person. Is there anything you need? Is there anything we can do for you? And again, it's just 9 times out of 10 they won't want anything. They'll be happy to help, but it's just checking in and making sure they're okay. And as an organisation, it shows that you care and you've got their well-being and their welfare at heart. So these are some of the ways that organisations can support staff returning to work. Phased return to work is a common one. Bereavement support, again, there's organisations like Cruise out there, and most hospices have bereavement support. That may be only available if the person has been cared for by the hospice, but they may have other services that they can recommend and look into. Dealing with associated sickness with compassion. And I think if you can treat grief after somebody has died, if they're off sick, a little bit differently to how you treat normal sickness, then I think that goes a long way as well. The opportunity to return to work in a different role or different department. One of the issues I'd just changed my job at the time my daughter got ill, and I linked that new office with getting phone calls from her saying, can you come to hospital? Her temperature's gone up to such and such. So when I went back, if I wanted to go into a different department to work for a while, and that again, really helped. Paid bereavement leave, obviously, if you can do that. And people often think it's all about the leave that people want, but it isn't. And again, it's about finding out about the individual and supporting the individual. I know someone whose mother died on the Friday and they were back at work on the Monday, and people were saying, oh, how heartless, coming back to work, the first available day after their parent had died. But actually they lived with their parent, and the last place they wanted to be was with that, it was in that house on their own with nobody around them, and actually being at work helped them and helped their general state of well-being. So again, it's about individuality. We're all different, we all grieve differently, and we all have different needs. Ask about support for other members of the family too. How's your wife doing? How's your husband doing? Children okay? Anything we can do? Funeral poverty is huge, and asking the question, are you okay? Are you okay to pay for the funeral? Have you got funds to pay for the funeral. I know with, again, with my daughter, my wife works for the civil service, and they have a benevolent fund, and they paid for part of my daughter's funeral. You know, that brought in guilt for me because I didn't pay for my daughter's funeral, but we have since paid them back. But at that time, we really needed that, you know, we really needed that help. I think it's 1 in 7 people get into financial difficulties following a funeral. So again, help and advice is out there, and you can, you know, if you need help and advice, you can ring a solicitor, you can ring, you know, at your local hospice, you can ring other organisations such as Cruise, and they will be able to offer advice and help. Allowing paid time off for grief-related appointments as well. If somebody's got to go and sort out probate and things like that, holidays are really precious. You know, I don't mean holidays as in going away. I mean holidays as in your days off, your annual leave. You know, it's really useful, and you really need it. And it's good if you don't have to use it going to, you know, spending the afternoon at a solicitor's or something like that. And again, at the bottom, you know, don't be assumptive. Bereavement is unique to each individual. Start off with the blank sheet of paper. Some of the cliches, some of the things that people say or assume. Oh, well, you've got another child. Yes, I had that said to me. At least you had a chance to say goodbye. It wasn't like she died in an accident. I had that said to me. Never ask a person how the person has died. If they want to tell you, let them tell you in their own time. Because again, if it's, you know, if it's something that's quite painful and difficult for them to talk about, then you're putting them under that pressure to, you know, to tell a story that they might not be ready to tell at that point. You know, never say you should be over it by now. As I say, there's no time limit on grief. People often say the first year is always the worst. Once you get the first anniversaries out of the way, yeah. I had a complete breakdown and was suicidal in the second year. The first year I didn't do too bad actually. But again, we're all different. Don't assume that you know how a person feels. You don't know people's relationships. So, you know, whereas you might have one person whose father died who might have had the best relationship possible with their father, you might have another person whose father died who didn't have a relationship at all. So saying I know how you feel isn't necessarily always the best thing to say. Time isn't necessarily a great healer. For some people it may be, and it's why I say at the top, don't assume and don't say. You know, most people learn to manage their grief as time goes on. They grow around it, as I mentioned earlier. Isn't it time you moved on? I always think that's something that people say because they're uncomfortable talking about grief. It's almost like they're saying, isn't it time you moved on, so then I don't have to talk about this anymore and we can talk about something else. But you don't move on from grief. As I say, you sort of work around it most of the time. And I don't think, oh, they've gone to a better place. The reason I put that on there is because if I would never say to somebody, you should not say they've gone to a better place. What I would say is, if you have a faith and you believe that when you die, you go to a better place, and the person you're supporting has that faith and has that belief, that might be the most comforting thing that you can say, and it might be the perfect thing to say. However, if the person you're talking to doesn't have that faith and doesn't share that faith, then it may not be an appropriate thing to say. So again, it's just about thinking about, you know, the person. And we move on to the next slide. So, you know, ways you can respond when you think somebody might be grieving. You know, saying, oh, I noticed that you're feeling a bit sad. You know, you seem a bit preoccupied. You know, acknowledging their grief, asking how it affects them. Remember, when you're supporting somebody, that treasure, trust, respect, empathy, acceptance, safety, unconditional, real, because it's a real experience, and expert. And the reason we put expert on there is individuals, you're the expert in your own grief, basically. You are your own grief expert. Nobody knows your grief better than you. Nobody knows how you deal with your grief better than you, and how you need to deal with it. And don't underestimate silence. You know, sometimes when you're talking to somebody and you're supporting somebody, don't always feel the need to talk. Sometimes silence is a nice pause that gets people to gather their thoughts and to reflect. Things you can say: you might not be ready to talk about it today, but when you are, I'm here to listen. And the reason I like that is because you're saying you might not be ready today, so when you are ready, when you're ready, not when I'm ready, but when you're ready, I'm here for you. And again, it's that acknowledgement. Asking people how they are. How often when somebody says, how are you, and you're having a rough time, do you say, I'm fine, yeah, I'm okay? You know, we all do it. We all do it. And sometimes it's just worth saying, how are you really? And if the person says, no, honestly, I'm fine, then it might be that they're not ready to talk about it today. But at least you're asking them and you're giving them that opportunity. You cannot fix grief. You can support and you can help, but you cannot fix. So if by nature you are a fixer where grief's concerned, you know, you're not going to fix. You will help, you can support, you can make things better, but you can't fix. And don't be afraid to admit you don't know what to say. It's far better to say, I'm really sorry, I don't know what to say, than to say something totally inappropriate, like you know, some of the things we saw on the previous slide. There is nothing wrong at all in saying you don't know what to say. And often if you say, I'm really sorry, I don't know what to say, the conversation will move on. The person will say, oh, that's okay, I'm feeling such and such, or I've done this, or I've been there. Excuse me. Self-care is really, really important. If you are supporting somebody who is grieving, it is really important that you look after yourself, because you will soak up a lot of emotion, you will soak up a lot of information. So whether you're grieving yourself or whether you're supporting somebody who's grieving, look after yourself. What you see on the screen is a first aid kit, and it's basically a green first aid kit with spaces in it. And the way this works is you can print this out, and we will send out copies of it. The idea is that you write in the spaces what you do to look after you. So if I was to write in these spaces on my personal first aid kit, because, you know, when we cut our fingers or we sprain our wrists, we go to our first aid kits and we put bandages and plasters on, and, you know, parents always used to say, there, that'll make it better. Bit of mum spit as well, probably, but, you know, there, plasters make it better. You can't put plasters on emotions. So it's important that you do things that make you feel good. So if I was writing in my personal first aid kit, I would be writing cycling, I'd be writing walking my dogs, I'd be writing listening to music, walking by the canal, watching rubbish television, all those sorts of things. So your first aid kit, your emotional first aid kit, is about you and you only, and what you do. What I would like you to do while I run through this and the next slide is, in the chat facility, just write down something, or it can be more than one thing, that you would put in your first aid kit. Okay? Anything at all, whatever you do to look after yourself. You might relax in a Radox bath. I'm showing my age now. There are some people who are smiling because they know what a Radox bath is. There are others who are looking puzzled, and they're just too young to understand what relaxing in a Radox bath is all about. So yeah, in the chat, just pop in some of the things that that you do to look after yourself. And while you're thinking about that, a couple of apps that are really good. Smiling Mind app is really good for meditation and mindfulness, as is Headspace, which the NHS used to use. They probably still do, but they used it as part of their wellbeing package. And the jar that you see with the multicolored layers is a memory jar. We use this a lot with children, but there's no reason that adults can't use this either as well. Often our memories are associated with colors. So it might be one of your memories is of a holiday, and the beach was yellow and the sea was blue, and all that sort of thing. And so what you do is, all you need to make a memory jar is salt, just normal table salt, and chalks, coloured chalks, and a piece of paper. And all you do is tip a bit of salt onto a piece of paper and colour your memories, basically. And then you just build up the layers, and people find them very sort of therapeutic. And also, one of the things that I'm sending out to you is the instruction for chocolate mindfulness. So you may all have heard of mindfulness, of being in the moment. I'm sending you out chocolate mindfulness. If you can see the picture on the screen and you can remember when arrows were 4p and icebreakers were in the shops, you're probably a similar age to me. Again, if you're looking them in bewilderment and can't imagine arrows ever having been 4p, you're probably a similar age to my daughter. A little bit about social media. This is Melissa's page on Facebook. With social media, you can do Facebook, you can do three things when somebody dies with a Facebook page. You can close it down, you can leave it open, or you can memorialize it. If you close it down, you lose everything. If you leave it open, you run the risk of spam, but if you can manage it, then that's not such a big problem if you've got the passwords. If you memorialize a Facebook page, then what that means is that anybody who's friends with that person remains a friend, and they can leave messages on birthdays, anniversaries, they can leave pictures and stuff like that, but no new friends can be added, and it stays as it is. I should point out again, for those of you who can see the screen, the reason that Mel's cover photo is just black isn't because that's what they do out of respect or anything like that. It's because cover photos hadn't been invented when we memorialized Melissa's page. So what would appear there now is whatever the cover photo was, and that stays the same, as does the profile picture. As an organization, when an employee dies, you've got no control over social media. You can't control what people put. If they put anything that's disrespectful, you can ask to have it taken down and you have control then. But in the first instance, you can't control what people put out there. What I always say to organizations is inform your staff that any information you deliver to them will come from official sources, and whatever they see on social media, or the written media in some cases, it's up to them whether they believe it or not, but you will only get official information from the organization. And also something to be aware of is that as an organisation, you may be apportioned blame in the death. If you think of Caroline Flack, they blamed the CPS. They said it was the CPS's fault because they were going to prosecute her for stuff that had happened. So you may have to deal with that. And I finished social media by saying for a bereaved person, social media can be a great high or an absolute low. I love it when I see friends of Melissa posting things on her Facebook timeline saying, oh, remember when we did this, missing you, thinking of you today. By the same token, when I see her friends getting married, having children, it breaks my heart, because that's all the things we wished for her. So you have to be careful as a bereaved person. You have to be really careful with social media. And I do have times when I just come off it because I think, you know what, I need a break from it. December is a normal time when I come off it because Mel really loved Christmas, and I can't, as a grieving person, even 12 years down the line, I can't deal with Mel's Facebook at Christmas. So I just step away from it. And that comes into the self-care aspect of it. It's about looking after yourself, whether you're supporting or whether you're being supported. I mentioned about the importance of signposting. What you will see, with the exception of St Giles and Crews, all of the organisations, St Giles and Crews offer generic support. So they will support anybody who's grieving, whatever the type of illness. However, there are organisations like SOBS who support people who are bereaved from suicide. There is SANS, the Stillbirth and Neonatal Charity. Support After Murder and Manslaughter is SAMS. Break for road crash victims, the Muslim Bereavement Support Service, and bereavement support for the military. And those of you who are following me down that list will see that I've missed one out, and I've missed it out on purpose because I save it till last. Do not underestimate pet bereavement. Yeah. our pets are important. They're part of our family. They're, you know, when they go, we grieve for our pets. We mourn our pets. So, you know, it's not a case of, oh, well, it's a pet. It's, you know, not as important as your parent. It's different. You know, I get that said to me a lot. Oh, well, you know, losing your daughter is the worst thing. No, it's different. You know, it's great. It's different. I don't grade it. It's just different. You can't compare the two, not because one is better than the other, but because they're different. So pet bereavement support, the Blue Cross is a really good organisation. I'm a dog walker myself, and you know we see people out with their dogs when I'm walking my dog, and I always used to see this couple and their 3 dogs, and then a couple of nights I saw them with 2 dogs, and the lady told me how she was really struggling, and I referred her to the Blue Cross. And she said a couple of weeks later that they were really good and that they really, really helped her. So much so that she actually did some fundraising for them. So yeah, Blue Cross are a really good organisation. And as I say, as an organisation, don't underestimate pet bereavement. You know, be as empathetic and compassionate as you would be under other circumstances. And I mentioned about the bereaved child. Winston's Wish and Child Bereavement UK are fantastic organisations for supporting children who are grieving, but also about explaining death to children. And if you live in the St Giles catchment area, we also have an organisation called Phoenix, which supports children and young people through their grief. And again, we treat everybody as an individual there. It's not about all one-to-one and that sort of stuff. We do one-to-one services, but we also do, you know, activities and things like that to help bring out people's emotions and things like that. So I think, yeah, we sort of come to the end now. I hope that that's been useful for you, and it's given you some. I always say with this presentation, I hope that it's made you think, and you know it's given you sort of food for thought, and it may be that all the things we say you're doing, it may be that you're not, it may be that you think some of the things we're doing aren't right, but ultimately it's about the individual. It's just treat everybody as an individual, and let that be your starting point.